honor and privilege to introduce to you Professor Laurence Boisson de Chazournes from University of Geneva. She is a fabulous professor, teaches international organizations, international economic law, has a whole wealth of experience working with the World Bank as senior counsel, doing investor-state arbitration, being a counsel before the International Court of Justice, a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, a lot of great experience with the WTO as well. And it's just, she's a fabulous person to know. I think in the business you won't find a nicer person, a more enlightened person, and it's wonderful to have her with us today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Boisson. Just two housekeeping points. If you would, turn off your cell phone, and if you have questions, please hold them to the end, and we'll reserve a few minutes for questions and answers. So thank you. Thank you. Time's yours.
Thank you, James. What a wonderful introduction. I'm afraid that you're going to be disappointed, but I must say that it's a pleasure. When James sent me an email and said, would you like to come to the University of Hong Kong, I was just very pleased. It's my first time here, so really it's a privilege. And so we've known each other for quite a long time. We've worked together on different projects, and so it's nice to be here and to be exchanging ideas. So I've suggested that we would speak about, I would present a topic which is linked to regional and universal organizations and past and present interactions. It's a topic I've been working on for a course that I gave at the Hague Academy of International Law. The course is published in French, and I'm working on a sort of English version, updated English version. And in fact, this topic, I think, is of interest because it deals with the governance of the world order. And it also, I think, stimulates us to be thinking about what is universality and what is regionalism. So I'm going to be touching on these notions, but maybe that in the course of the discussion we can come back to that. Now, I've said also that I will be speaking about peace and security issue mostly, because I had to find a field where I could look at the interactions. But looking at what's going on in the field of financial governance and investment, public investment governance, I think it's interesting because with the creation of this new China Investment Bank, which is quite attractive to a lot of European countries, you see that regionalism is still there, and it's something that we have to think about is there still room for a universalist approach in terms of the governance of the world order, or are we going to be seeing blocks, regional blocks appearing in different areas of world governance? So this is the introduction. Now, what I'll do is that I will start with the perspective of the 19th century. It's going to be brief. Move to the League of Nations. It's linked to Geneva, of course. And then I will look at the insights that were drawn from the experience of the League of Nations for building, creating the United Nations system. And then I will say a few words about the practice and what are the relationships between the United Nations and regional organizations today, and which are the legal problems which are appearing. Now, you have a wonderful professor who is very much versed in theory of international organizations, and more from sort of the realistic, practical side. So I will give you insights of the practice, but then maybe we can discuss about what it means in terms of the theoretical approach to international organizations. So starting with where we come from, okay? Regionalism versus universalism before the League of Nations. And when I prepared the course that I gave, I was fascinated with the fact that, in fact, the 19th century is really a laboratory for what was felt as need in terms of international governance. obviously, and we can come back to that in the discussion, the political situation of the 19th century was very special. It was a time it was Europeocentric. It was also a time of building of the colonization period. So there were some political features that we don't have anymore today. But it's interesting to see that it's really in the course of the 19th century that the states, the existing states of that time, felt the need to build collective action, so to promote certain common interests. So it started with the Congress of Vienna, and in the Congress of Vienna, if you look at the act of the Congress of Vienna, it's quite interesting that already was foreseen the necessity to build regional organizations. If we think about the river commissions with respect to the Rhine and the Danube and other commissions which were built, established in the course of the 19th century. What is interesting also with the 19th century is sort of the rising of the international administrative unions. They were drawn from the economic evolutions which was taking place in the Western world and so on. And there also you see that states needed to harmonize their standards, needed to have a common language with respect to economic exchanges, trade exchanges, intellectual property rights exchanges. And so for that, they needed to have institutional mechanisms. Health was also an important issue, and because trades were starting and there were risk of spreading of pandemias and so on, so necessity to create new types of institutions and so on. And then at the end of the 19th century, we had the Hague conferences, and there certain frameworks were established, and mostly in the field of justice, international justice, with the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and then afterwards with the Permanent Court of International Justice. Now, where do I want to come with this type of presentation? What I think is interesting is that, true that when we speak about universalism in the context of the 19th century, one could say that it's a restricted universalism, but at least there were certain endeavors of this type, okay, to have all the states involved. With the administrative unions, that's the case. But at the same time, and this is the point I want to make, at the same time, already the states felt, even though there were not many, they felt the need to have what we call regional endeavors, regional initiatives. So this, I think, is something which is interesting, and maybe this is something we can come back to the discussion. In discussion is the fact that the regional building of cooperation was there right from the beginning. And states felt the need also to sort of have limited scope institutional cooperative mechanisms. Now, a lot of these regional endeavors have stimulated the creation of universal organizations, and that's something also that is important in terms of the dynamic between regional, in the relationships between regional organizations and universal organizations. So we have the framework. Now, this brings me to think about, to go to the 20th century, the early part of the 20th century, and as you've learned with Professor Fry, the early part of the 20th century is an important period for the building of the world of international organizations, stricto sensu. It was with the Versailles Treaty that two organizations were created. One is the League of Nations, and the other one is the International Labour Organization. Now, what is interesting is that if you look at the Versailles Treaty, it was really this need felt to build something universal. And I'm going to be looking more at the League of Nations. There you have the imprint of a state mind, President Wilson, who really looked at the world from all the constraints of the political order of that time, okay? But looked at it from a universal perspective. And he had also a certain approach to the world. He was drawing insights from what had happened before the First World War. He was looking at the problems of wars, and for him, and that's the point I want to make and look at with you, for him, he wanted to ban regional alliances in the field of peace and security. Okay? So the League of Nations was an initiative to launch what is called a collective security system, and it has a certain collective security system with its own features that you've studied with James. And in the context of this universalistic system, there was a very strong point made by President Wilson, who was that we would have a universal organization banning, putting aside regional alliances and arrangements. Okay? So I'm going to call organizations initiatives which might have their own will, maybe not an international legal personality, but this is not really the matter of today's presentation. So that was the idea of President Wilson, and you also have in mind his speech of 8 January 1918, point 14, which is really the shaping of the League of Nations. It's point 14 says, the proposal of Wilson was a general association of nations which must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states. Now, for him, really, the system that he wanted to see was that all states should be guaranteed their independence and their territorial integrity. And this should be a principle which should be respected, abided by all states of the world. So that was the vision of President Wilson. Something also which is important with President Wilson is that for him, this collective system, this vision was supposed to play like a moral force. He had also a certain moral vision about the world order and what it should be, and it was also, I think, linked to his religious beliefs. He was a Presbyterian, and he was also instrumental for states to choose Geneva as the headquarters for the League of Nations. So, if I'm stressing these points just to show that in the model that President Wilson was proposing, there was no provision on regional mechanisms or arrangements. For him, they were to be banned, and so his vision about the relationships between universal and regional organizations was that we put aside the regional alliances. But President Wilson had to face the domestic constituencies in the United States, and especially the Senate. And at that time, there was the problem of the mistrust by the American politicians and some members of the public about the fact that a universal system would be sufficient, and in a universal system, there was also the problem for the US constituencies which were not in favor of the Wilson project, that there might be a risk of interference of the regional powers in so-called American affairs. And behind all this was the Monroe Doctrine, and the Monroe Doctrine is linked to the Napoleonic Wars, which had been engaged by France in the 19th century, and they in order to react, the Monroe Doctrine was framed, and it was really something which was built so that to prevent any European interference in the Americas. So President Wilson was aware of that, was aware of the importance of this doctrine for a lot of people in the United States, and he was also aware that there was also some willingness to count on regional endeavors for guaranteeing security. He tried to sell his model, and he was not successful. And in fact, he had to make the proposal to include in the League of Nations Article 21. Article 21 of the League of Nations is an interesting provision which is included in the League of Nations, and it's something which is nothing in this covenant shall be deemed to affect the validity of international engagements, such as treaties of arbitration or regional understandings like the Monroe Doctrine for securing the maintenance of peace. So this was a big compromise that President Wilson had to make in terms of the inclusion, and it created a lot of problems for the negotiators because I didn't put it in the PowerPoint. You also had a provision in the League of Nations, which was Article 20, which was an attempt to establish a hierarchy of norms and the primacy of the League of Nations covenant towards other treaties. And the questions which was never really resolved was the relationship between Article 20 and Article 21 of the League of Nations, of the Covenant of the League of Nations. Now, so this, there was also this, the problem of the relationship of Article 21 with Article 10 of the Covenant of the League of Nations, which was ensuring independence and territorial integrity to all states. But I think it's important to, I just wanted to stress this, just to show that even though the community as such, at the beginning of the 20th century was small, about 30 states, there was already this need felt by states, and not just the American constituency was proposing that, because in Europe you also had European states which were pushing for these regional initiatives. But you already had this firm belief that regionalism should find a place in a universal system, and that's the point I want to make. Now, this, the inclusion of Article 21 in the Covenant of the League of Nations caused quite many problems in terms of interpretation, and I've just listed some of the interpretation, and we're not going to go through that. First of all, there was this problem of the linguistic ambiguity, and this is something that we're often confronted with between the French version and the English versions. The English version seemed to affirm the primacy of the Monroe Doctrine. The French version, on the contrary, was interpreted in saying that the primacy should go to the League of Nations Covenant. There was also an issue of the which regional understandings should be validated under Article 21, and there has been great uncertainty about how regional understanding should be interpreted. Then reference to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine, what did it mean? And what was really its meaning? There was only one country to define it, but the others were also members of the League of Nations, and they were party to a multilateral treaty. And this, it has been observed that because the United States didn't become a member to the League of Nations, so the country which had insisted for the inclusion of a provision that was important to it was not a member, and the others had to interpret a provision that was not really clear for them. So this showed the ambiguities, and I think that's what is important, the ambiguities of the relationship between universal and regional organizations, and in practice, in fact, that undermined the universal system of collective security, because you had, in fact, a lot of regional arrangements which were negotiated between the various countries, members of the League of Nations, and at some point the League of Nations attempted to react, but it was not successful, and it had to live with these regional arrangements. And that shows, I think, us that it's, I think, difficult to not associate these two dimensions. And it's something maybe that we can come back in the discussion. Especially, this is something important, as today there are much more countries in the world, and it's difficult to dissociate the universal perspective from the regional perspective. That's one point I want to make. The other question is that it's also, what was drawn as an insight from the practice of the League of Nations is that the relationship was equivocal. It was not a clear relationship, and I think it shows the weaknesses of the League of Nations. I don't think that the League of Nations was weak in all respects. There were some normative endeavors which were quite interesting, but and James Fry is a specialist of some of these initiatives in terms of armament and disarmament and so on. But in terms of institutional, in terms of the maintenance of peace and security, the organization showed some weaknesses, and it acquired a sort of status of passive spectator to what was going on. And this, I think, is something that was looked at by the ones who had to negotiate the Charter of the United Nations. So those were some points that I wanted to make about the League of Nations, so that to understand how we move towards a system of collective security established by the Charter of the United Nations. So we move to the UN system, and it's interesting to see, as I say, that there are lessons which are going to be drawn from the experience of the League of Nations. And I always tell the students, as surely James does, that we would not have the charter that we have without the experiment of the League of Nations, and that we should also speak in terms of weaknesses, but also in terms of benefits that were brought by the experience of the League of Nations. Now, one I think lesson which was drawn was that there was a need for a not too rigid conception of universalism. That meant that there was a need for room made to regional endeavors, but at the same time there was a need to, if you would make room for regional endeavors, you need to have a clear and coherent hierarchy. And hierarchy, we'll see what are the features of these hierarchies. So that was the lesson. Now it's interesting to see that when the charter was negotiated, there were several proposals which were made, and it's interesting to see that at Dumbarton Oaks, the proposal was still to establish strongly the universalist approach to peace and security maintenance. And it was interesting. It's interesting because it was very much pushed by President Wilson, by President Roosevelt, and the United States. So the universalist approach was still very predominant in the proposal at the time of Dumbarton Oaks. Now, afterwards, when it went to San Francisco, the features of the relationship between the United Nations and the regional organization changed. It's interesting this was a time when regional organizations had been established, at least in Latin America. You already had certain initiatives which were already well established, and between the time of the Dumbarton Oaks negotiations and San Francisco, the League of Arab States had been established. So you also had the Arab states which were pushing to have their own regional organization. So for that, you had more and more states which were saying that there was a need to have more sort of acknowledgement of the role, the possible role of regional organizations in the context of a universal system of collective security. So what we have now in terms of the architecture of in the United Nations Charter, it's the result of compromises which were made by those who wanted a universal approach, those who wanted more space created for regional organizations. You have a specific chapter in the Charter dedicated to regional arrangements organizations. So that's, I think, something which is important, and it's a lesson which is drawn from the League of Nations, that the relationship between regional and universal organizations is demarcated. Then, if you look at Chapter 8, you have two provisions which are interesting. The first one is Article 52, and it has to do with pacific settlement of dispute, and it goes along with Article 33 of the Charter. And the interpretation, at least at the time, because it has evolved since the adoption of the UN Charter, but there was this sort of idea that states would submit first their disputes to regional arrangements, agreements and organizations before bringing them in the framework of the Charter. So there was this local or regional focus which was put on the primacy of the regional focus put on regionalism. Now, Article 53 has to do with enforcement measures. Enforcement measures meaning mostly resort to force. And there, it's interesting to see that there we have really the monopoly, which is retained for the Security Council for the determination of enforcement measures. But, and that is what is interesting, is that there we have a clear hierarchy in favor of the universal organization, the Security Council. At the same time, we had a compromise which was made with the inclusion of Article 51 of the UN Charter. Article 51, which is referring to self-defense. And so this was, with respect to resort to force, this was the space, the legal space, which was created for so-called regional endeavors. But there is no mention of its collective. When you look at the phrase of Article 51, it's collective, but collective meaning including possibility of regional initiatives. And it's interesting also to see that Article 51 is not limited to one region or another. It's this universal approach to collective action being able to be conducted at the regional level, or in whatever exceptions you have it, and we'll come to that. So we have a system which is different from the one of the League of Nations. And what the point I wanted to make is that we started with a universalist approach at the beginning of the 20th century. The compromises had to be made, but the compromises highlighted the weakness of the universal organization in the context of the Charter of the United Nations. Regional experiments were taken on board, but there was this sense that there was a need to sort of draw in a clear manner, if we could say, in a clear manner, the relationship between regional and universal organization. So this was sort of the model that we can have. Now, what is interesting, and you had that in your classes with James Fry, that this model has evolved. This model has evolved, and it has evolved because the international community has changed a lot since 1945. Before I turn to the post 1945, what I would like to say is that it's when you look at in '92, there were important reports issued by the then Secretary General of the United Nations. It was Mr. Boutros Ghali, Egyptian, and he issued what is named the Agenda for Peace of 1992. And for those interested in this relationship between universalism and regionalism, those are interesting reports, because really the realism of Boutros Ghali led him to sort of assert more firmly the role that regional organizations should play together with the United Nations. And when you look at the report of the Agenda for Peace, there is something which is interesting, that Boutros Ghali is making the point that Article 21 of the Covenant of the League of Nations noted the validity of regional involvement in the regulation of peace and security. So sort of the grounding of this assertion of the role of regional organizations was for him linked to Article 21 of the League of Nations, then with the Charter as such, Chapter 8, and interpretation, subsequent interpretation, which were made of of the Charter. So that's the other point that I want to make is that we have a practice since 1945. We have this insights about the relationships, and what I think we are all aware of is that since 1945 there has been a proliferation of regional organizations for different reasons, but in fact there were a few universal organizations. When I speak of universal organizations open to all members of the international community, there were a few of these organizations that were created and were constituted the system of the United Nations in the aftermath of the Second World War. But at the same time, the states felt the necessity to create a great number of regional organizations and arrangements. And the reasons are many, and just if we link that to peace and security, it was the Cold War, which on both sides emulated the desire to have regional arrangements. It was also the need to rebuild the countries. It was also the problem of the relationship between France and Germany, and the need to strengthen the relationship between these two countries, and that's the origin of the European Union, and that's important to know. It's linked to peace and security issue. It was also, I think, later on in the course of the second part of the 20th century, it was also the decolonization and self-determination which favored the creation of regional organizations and the importance for African countries and for Asian countries to have their own organizations with their own system in terms of managing their common interest. So what I think is interesting, and that's the point I want to make, is that in the field of peace and security, there was a need felt that the universal organization was important, but in fact, it was also felt that it was very important to have regional mechanisms which could protect the interest of the concerned states. And the end result at the end of the Cold War, early 90s and early part of the 21st century where we are, is that in fact when we look at the number of organizations, much more regional organizations than universal organizations, and in terms of governance, this is something which is important. And the question for us is, so how has the universal organization, the United Nations, reacted to this phenomenon? And it's there where I think that there are crucial legal issues that are arising. We don't yet have the answers, but I think that those are the points that you're discussing in the courses, in the classes. What we see is that, this is obvious for a lot of you, but in terms of peace and security, there are organizations which have financial resources, material resources, and so on, which are much more important than the United Nations, in terms that there is an imbalance in terms of power, in terms of equipment, in terms of finance. And there is also, from the part of some regional organization, an expansionist vision of their role in the world order. So there are regional organizations, but also looking at what's going on in other parts of the world, and obviously NATO is one of them. And you have, it's interesting to see the evolution of the mandate of NATO with respect to peace and security issues. In a way, it's a bit also the same with the European Union, this expansion of its role in terms of peace and security on the world stage. And the question then is, how does it fit with the Charter, the United Nations Charter? And what I think what is interesting is that what we see is that the Security Council has taken a pragmatic approach to cooperation on peace and security. Pragmatic approach in a way that I remember that I spoke about the Chapter 7, Chapter 8, In fact, when you look at the practice of the Security Council and when the Security Council is sort of involving regional mechanisms, it's very difficult to trace really the legal basis, and it is because there is a mixing of these two chapters, and it's also because of due to the willingness of some of the regional organizations. And so the pragmatic approach is that the Security Council take into account the regional organization without confining this regional organization to a specific role. Now, from what I have seen, and we can debate about that, in terms of resort to force, I don't think that for the time being you still have the primacy of the Security Council in terms of authorization of resort to forceful enforcement measures. I'm stressing forceful enforcement measures because in terms of economic sanctions and so on, I don't think that there is a primacy, and I think that the regime has evolved. But so you still has this primacy, but when you look at the practice, it's interesting to see that so the authorization should be given ex ante, but you have examples and a practice which is that the authorization can be given ex post. Okay? So there is a need, I think, to be looking at that. Some have criticized this practice because is it weaknessing? Is it a sign of weakness of the universal system in terms of peace and security? Maybe, and I think that in a way the Security Council should be more assertive. Now, this being said, we all know that the Security Council can be blocked, and we've seen that with Syria and other areas of conflicts. And so the question is really what should be the relationship between the universal organization and regional organizations. The other element that I want to highlight is that we have also seen in practice the operation of hybrids model of cooperation. So the first one was really Darfur. You had a mixed operation between the United Nations and the African Union, and if you look at the resolution of the Security Council, it's really a combination of different elements with a clear willingness of the African Union and Sudan to have the African Union fully on board at equal level with the United Nations. Now, I've not really had time to look carefully at all that, but I suspect that what's going on in Mali, what's going on in the Central African Republic is a bit the same, okay? And that means that are we going to turn towards these sort of hybrid models of cooperation in terms of enforcement measures, and which are the problems which could arise? And one of these problems for for lawyers, it's the issue of responsibility and accountability. Okay, so who is responsible of what, and who is accountable to whom, and how to feature these issues. And there, you already, that's linked to what you've been discussing, and your professor has written interesting articles in this respect. It's the problem of engagement of international responsibility of international organizations, and there are different models that maybe could be identified, the ultimate authority and control, but with what I've described to you, can we really say that the United Nations or the Security Council of the United Nations has the ultimate authority or control on an operation, which is combined and led conjointly with a regional organization? Should it be joint and concurrent responsibility? This is, I think, a road that the special rapporteur of the International Law Commission had favored. But then, if we have such, I think that would make more sense, the joint and concurrent responsibility. It means that we need to know exactly who is supposed to do what and how. And this is where I think we are facing another problem with regional organizations, is that, yes, at the beginning when I introduced the Charter, I said, and the evolution, I said that they're strong organizations, at least in terms of finance, in terms of which NATO, military equipment, NATO and the European Union. But when I'm speaking of Darfur, when I'm speaking of Mali, when I'm speaking of the Republic of Central Africa, it's there we have the African Union, and the African Union is not as powerful as NATO and the European Union, the training of the people and so on. So that means that, yes, we should consider that it's a responsible, legally responsible organization, but at the same time, is it really concurrent responsibility, the model that we should establish? And in addition to that, what we see also with the African Union is that NATO and the European Union are contracting out a lot of their responsibility to this organization for different reasons. They don't want to be any more involved in Africa or in other regions, so they are asking this regional organization to do an important part of the job. And so shouldn't we also involve the responsibility of these Western organizations? So with that, what I want to say is that there has been, I think, an important evolution. It seems to me that we still have a certain form of primacy for the Security Council in terms of authorization of resort to enforcement measures, but then when there has been an authorization, very often it's linked to the action, to the involvement of a regional organization, and the lines of demarcation in terms of responsibility, in terms of initiatives, are not that well set. And having looked at work done by some people in this field, it's interesting to see that we don't have a unique model. We have different models. Each time it's a specific case. So the specificities or the casuistic approach, I think, is interesting, but it also means for lawyers that we're not fully equipped to have the right instruments for facing this new situation in terms of peace and security. Thank you.
Okay, great, wonderful. Thank you very much. Let's open it up to questions. Perhaps we can take maybe 3 questions, and then we'll have a response, and then some more questions.
And maybe we don't have to speak only about peace and security. If you
whatever questions.
Other areas of cooperation.
There you go. Yeah. Perfect.
Thanks, Professor. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I want to ask you a question: is in order to change the weakness of universal organization, how do you think the UN should reform, or the Security Council should reform to enhance their strong part in maintain the peace and security? Thank you.
Other questions? All right, well, why not just address that question first?
Yeah, it seems to me that when I looked at the United Nations Charter, I mostly spoke about Chapter 8 because that was the room made to regional organization. Then I say that Chapter 7 there's there, and in fact there was a migration of Chapter 8 in Chapter 7. But looking at the means and the tools that were given to the United Nations, I think it's interesting to look at Chapter 7, because in Chapter 7 you had Article 42 for the decision to resort to enforcement measures, and you had for Article 43, Article 43, where by the states, the member states of the United Nations were asked, they committed, in fact, when they became a party to the United Nations, to put at the disposal of the United Nations, through the negotiation of treaties, means at the disposal of the United Nations, so that the United Nations could have its own army or military equipment for conducting activities. It was that never was put in place, so Article 43 didn't become effective in a way that it was foreseen at the time of the negotiations of the United Nations Charter. I'm not so sure that now we spoke about Glennon and others, and if you want to intervene, James, you should, were saying that in fact the only way to face the situation is to give the United Nations its own army and so on, and that would be a way to rebuild the normative system and the institutional system in terms of the management of peace and security, it seems to me that it's no more the mood of the states of the world, and that it seems to me that in a way they have favored this regional approach and this cooperation between regional organizations and the universal organization. And it would be, it seems to me that this is where we have to be looking at how regional organizations are interpreting and conducting their peace and security activities. And we often speak about the accountability of the United Nations system in this respect, the Berami case and so on, the ombudsperson who was created for sanctions. But I don't think we speak enough about the accountability of regional organizations and the principles and values that they should stick to in terms of the conduct of enforcement measures. And this is where there is a need for reflection. So in link to that, in Europe you have the CADI decisions and so on, but it's rather specific. And when you look at enforcement measures with respect to the European Union, this is not in the purview of the Court of Justice. So I don't think you're going to have any judicial control as such, but shouldn't we have other types of accountabilities? And it's also interesting to see that the Security Council has realized that it has to cooperate and work more closely with regional organizations, so you have regular exchanges between the United Nations and regional organizations, and this is where I think where the United Nations maybe should have exercised its right of initiative and ask them to be accountable and explain how they intend to combat the enforcement measures.
Thank you very much for a very enlightening discussion. When you look forward to the next 20 or 30 years, and you see the extent to which states, markets and civil society groupings are becoming more aligned and more intertwined in a variety of ways, such that really some of these regional and international organizations no longer can claim the kind of Weberian legitimacy that we've traditionally ascribed to them. Because in fact some of the regional groupings of civil society bodies are now as legitimate in the sense that they are empathetic, they are close to the action, they have more knowledge than some of our regional and international bodies. So do you see a greater diversity, a great threat to questions of legitimacy and great problems of accountability in the next 20 to 30 years?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I'm sure that you also have your thinking about that. It seems that in French we have this expression which is the parent pauvre. This is sort of an issue which has not really been looked at, and I think it deserves more attention, and especially because when we speak in terms of international organizations, obviously it's also the basis of the building of this regional arrangements organization is our political motivations. Okay? Political motivation, they can be diverse. Okay, so at the time of the Cold War, when you look at the Council of Europe, it was because of the Cold War, it was because of USSR, it was because the need felt to protect certain common values, rule of law, democracy, and so on. And you can see that. But now you have more and more of these regional mechanisms which are put in place not really for protecting this kind of values, but for protecting political interest. Okay, and for that, it's this is something where, and I think it's something that we've not yet worked on sufficiently in the field of international organizations. Is that how can you justify from a legitimacy viewpoint that you're a regional organization, and what should be the terms of the accountability and so on. And so one question, and maybe that's something that we can, you might bring some ideas in this debate, is when you look at, for example, European regional organizations, obviously those are the ones I know better about, you have parliamentary organs which are there, okay? And the most accomplished one is the European Parliament for the European Union. I think it's now. I don't think that you can have such an organ in the context of the United Nations. It would not make much sense, and but we should have a much broader involvement of the civil society. But in terms of the other regional organizations, I think that we also have to think about how to create more legitimacy between the people, the populations, and the political organs. And this is where we will see that there is still much reluctance from certain regions of the world to have such possibility. But I don't know if you have other ideas. But it's interesting to see that we, for the time being, we've been looking at certain organizations, and we've not been looking at the new, sort of the newly created organizations in the second part of the 20th century, which are, in fact, presenting a lot of gray areas. Yeah, and so the one experiment which has been conducted for ASEAN, you might be aware of this big research which was initiated by Singapore and the ASEAN. I think that's an interesting one because they favored the involvement of others to look at what they are and where they should go. So maybe that could be something that we scholars could take on board, is look at specific regional organizations and see how they move and what is the practice and so on.
Just very quickly, if you don't mind, on that whole issue, I think the two interrelated challenges along the lines that you're suggesting. The first is to recognize, as there is, as you're well aware, a growing literature on private authority or private power in global governance, and the extent to which I think we're going to find what I call conflated or fused organizations that actually straddle the boundaries. Now, they raise some phenomenally interesting challenges, both from your perspective as an academic lawyer and practitioner, and in a sense from mine as a political scientist and public administration person. And I just think that really, if we're going to tackle these sorts of challenges in a sensible way, the disciplinary boundaries have to be broken down quite significantly, because we're still operating in our well-defined silos, as it were. But that's really just an observation at this stage. But I appreciate what you say. Thank you.
Just following those interesting questions, also I would like to know about the impact of technology, because technology also is blurring the boundaries between states. It happens especially in young people. Those people are interacting right now using the technology. So rather than going to even not regional, maybe also not universal, because universal is only sometimes just one approach. It's more diversified, coming from each citizen per se, each participant in this technology. I think for the next 20 or 30 years, that actually we see these complex interactions with young people, young generation, and the traditional political, establishment.
No, but of course, that the technology will have a lot of impacts on the sort of the modes of governance. That's I don't deny it. I was just looking at all this from another angle. It's sort of the institutional approach to the managing of sort of common interest and so on. And but it's interesting that technology. So we think of the International Union of Telecommunications. It's interesting to see how this organization is in fact dealing with the regions. It has created its own regional institutions. So this is something which is interesting, in that there is no organization which has put aside this need to have this nexus between a universal approach and a regional approach. Now, so this is interesting in terms of governance. Now you could also challenge me with my conception of the regional approach, because in fact, and that's the big weakness also of these assertions, is that regions we don't have a definition of what is a region. Okay, and the geographical criteria are not sufficient. In some cases, they can play a role, for example, in the context of the law of the sea, fisheries, and so on. But with respect to the political matters, I don't think that they fit. If you look at the European Union, for example, if you look at ASEAN, it doesn't mean much. So that means that you need to have geographic criteria as well as sharing of values, a notion of solidarity. And when you come to the realms of the sharing of solidarity, sharing of values, you see that they can be quite extensive, and they are very much linked also to the projection of political interest of a special country towards other countries and so on. And so maybe that's also something to be looked at more carefully, is that we have this sort of assertion that regionalism is something important, but what really is regionalism? What is the meaning of this sort of grouping?
We probably have time for one more question. I suspect someone in the room has a question about joint and concurrent responsibility. I know they're probably dying to ask a question on this, but don't feel any pressure to ask a question.
No,
but,
it's a difficult
yeah,
one.
I know. Anyway, let's, if that person wants to ask the question, they can. But if not, we'll have James go ahead. Yeah,
sorry.
Go ahead.
Professor, thank you for the wonderful lecture. My question is, do you have any comments on recent China's enthusiasm in promoting Asian infrastructure investment bank? And would you classify World Bank as universal and Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank as regional? And what is the relationship between the two banks?
As a scholar, I'm fascinated with this new experiment, I must say, because I've been working, as James said, I've been working with the World Bank, so I've sort of followed what the World Bank was doing, and I write about it. I've been looking at the reforms, at the attempted reforms of the IMF, and so on. And obviously, when you look at this organization and the governance structure of these organizations, there is something which is no more in link with the reality, with the economic reality. And the financial crisis in 2008, I think, sent a signal that something had to be changed. Okay, so we had the convening of the G20 group and so on, with the proposal to reform the governance of the IMF and the World Bank and so on. When you look at the reaction of these two organizations, it's quite interesting to see that they've been very slow to react. So the World Bank, I think that it has not really changed its governance scheme. The IMF, there was more willingness to change it, but the reform and change it in a way that China would have its right rank in the governance structure of the two organizations. In the context of the World Bank, they have sort of enlarged the number of shares that China could have, but it has not changed the ranking of the country. The IMF, the decision was that China would become the second shareholder after the United States. But the reform process was blocked and is blocked with the US Senate. Okay, so nothing has happened. And at the same time, and this is something which I think is interesting in terms of identity, is that you had what we call the BRICS, okay? Starting to say, but we also have a role to play in the world governance, okay? So you had, in Latin America, you had the convening of meetings in Brazil with the BRICS to establish a new bank as such. Now, what is interesting is that most of the money for the time being is coming from China, not from the other BRICS for different reasons. But it was not sufficient for China, okay? And I think that the China experiment with this new regional financial institution is that they were not satisfied with the regional creation of the Asian Development Bank, because the structure of the Regional Development Bank is also reflective of a certain order. So in order to challenge this, the way that they have foreseen was to create a new institution. A new institution where China would have the leading role. Okay? And it's said clearly right from the beginning. And it has said that it will have a leading role, but it also inviting other countries. And you've seen that a lot of Western countries are just running to join this new institution. So this, I think, is quite emblematic of what's going on And this also, I think this is going to be interesting with respect to the relationship between the universal and the regional, is that there are going to be more and more challenges of this type. And it's, I think for universal organizations, I would defend a lot. I defend the regional organizations because I think it's important that you have places where all countries of the world meet and discuss and exchange, even if there is diversity and tension. But anyhow, we have to have these places. But for universal organizations, they also have to adjust themselves to the new world, and they have to find a way to transform themselves if they want to remain relevant in the world order.
Great. We're actually out of time. Sorry. Maybe we can. You can ask your question afterwards.
Just very quickly. What do you think about the growing role of the EU in regarding to peace and security? Just briefly, you mentioned, for example, regarding sanctions against Russia and Syria, and this is connected with with your presentation. What do you think is going to happen
with the role of the EU? But I don't have a clear idea on this. Being European, living in Europe, I just feel that Russia is part of Europe. It's not only Europe, but it's part of Europe. So for me, and there is a war in Ukraine. So I think that there is something wrong going on in Europe these days. And so now the entitlement of the EU to adopt sanctions against Russia, my own viewpoint is that I don't think that's very illegal, but I may be challenged and contested, but I don't think that we've seen the practice which has evolved. It's no more under the purview of Article 53. There's an admittance that regional organizations can adopt sanctions. Are they proportionate? Are they in accordance with human rights standards and so on? That's another issue. But it's a test case for the European Union, because to have a war in Europe means something.
Thank you.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking Professor Boisson de Chazournes. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah.